been to Esalen before. It's an extraordinary place with an extraordinary history, an extraordinary morphogenetic field. The baths are open 24 hours a day. The massage staff is the best in the world, and take advantage of all of these things. Know that you can cross a small bridge at the other side of the garden, and there's a whole other section of Esalen, which is very beautiful and nicely landscaped, and that's the way to get down to the sea. In front of that building, which is obviously and is called the Big House, there's a system of stairways which take you down to the beach. So that's highly recommended. Okay, I think that's the basic thing. There's always toast and jam and usually coffee and stuff like that in the dining room whenever it's open. So if you miss a meal or if you get the munchies, that's available. This one I'm pretty much, I'm up to speed on this one. This is, Kathleen's helping me out because usually I don't know what I'm teaching, and if there's no catalog in the room, then we're sort of hung out to dry. But this one I'm highly motivated, and so I've been looking forward to it, the briefing for Descent into Novelty.
What has made you highly motivated?
Well, because there's a plunge into novelty happening. So the idea, or I'm claiming there is. So then we actually have something to look at and measure all this baffle garb against rather than the usual vapor, you know. This is part of my life that I enjoy most, and it's hard to carry the public into it because it's so arcane. But this is really where the thrills lie for me, which I guess leads me into some of what I want to say this evening. Let me lay out for you how I see this briefing for Descent into Novelty and what that really means, because it's deliberately ambiguous, because it refers to several things simultaneously. Any encounter with me that involves a discussion of psychedelics is in and of itself a briefing for a descent into novelty. That's what psychedelics are. The ordinary structures and momentum and logic of the world is replaced by a very novel redaction of those things. So that's one level of the meaning of the briefing for a descent into novelty. Another level of meaning is we are plunging, without the aid of my theory, toward the end of the millennium. And this will be used as a benchmark and an enormous kind of goad to certain agendas to complete themselves or launch themselves. And I'm sure as we approach the millennium, you can feel the built-in apocalyptic expectations of Judeo-Christian culture just swelling to burst at the seams. Well, I think anybody who didn't have some kind of fairly strong model of what is going on would be scared to death. I mean, there is a sense of everything simply flying apart. I mean, we don't know what it will be. World economic crash, Ebola outbreak, asteroid strike, climate change, but it just begins to multiply to the point where you get the feeling we may not know what's coming, but God, something must be coming. So 1,000 years is reaching its culmination, and inevitably this civilization will be divided at this millennium. There will be the first millennium of industrial, post-medieval, so forth and so on, and then whatever comes after. And then a third sense in which this is a briefing for a descent into novelty, and this requires a little backgrounding for those of you who aren't familiar with the time wave theory, which has now been referred to repeatedly. This is an idea, a mathematical formalism which I generated with the help of the Logos, that addresses the concept of the Tao, a mysterious force which ebbs and flows through all things, building structure up and tearing it down according to mysterious laws of its own, takes that notion of Tao and attempts to demystify it in the sense of, if Tao is a force which tears things down and builds things up and down can be directions on a Cartesian axis. So why not portray the Tao as the ebb and flow of a quality, a numerically quantifiable quality? Well, to cut to the chase, I've done this, and it replaces the Newtonian assumption that time is a perfectly smooth Aristotelian surface with a much more complicated version of what time is. Time is a kind of landscape, or a kind of topological manifold or surface over which events flow, but subject to the contours of that surface. So that in the same way a river running through rocky gorges attains great speed and power, but when it flows out onto the flatlands, it loses that momentum, it spreads out, it meanders. Time is a similar kind of phenomenon. There are periods of great placidity and stability and continuity. Most of time has been like that. Change in most of time is something that stretches out over millions and millions of years. I'm speaking now, first of all, of astrophysical changes, planetological evolution, even biological evolution, which is orders of magnitude more rapid than geology, is nevertheless something which moves in a very stately fashion. Major mutations require hundreds of thousands, millions of years in some cases to establish themselves. So most of time exhibits a fairly uniform placidity on the local scale, if you see what I mean. But for the past 25,000 years, or 50,000, or a million, depending on your sensitivity to turbulence, something else has been happening. Acceleration, connectivity, a complexification and densification of the matrix. And we are products of this. But it isn't a smooth descent or ascent toward greater complexity. It's a punctuated movement toward complexity, or novelty, as I call it. There are steps back. There are setbacks. Sometimes they last millions of years. Sometimes they last minutes. And this leads me then, that's enough background. So one reason this is called a descent into, briefing for a descent into novelty, is because according to this theory, we are in a descent into novelty. A very dramatic descent began on the 25th of February, just a week ago. In the 20th century, there have only been two other periods that the theory defines as this novel. The first one is the period from October 1928 to October 1929, and the second one is from December 1940 to December of 1941. Now, interestingly, both of those purely formal mathematical predictions nail major upheavals of novelty in the 20th century. The first, the collapse of the world economy, culminating in the American stock crash of October 29. The second, World War II, raging furiously all through 1940, and then ending in December 41 by the U.S. being dragged in with the Japanese attack. So the novelty theory is in the midst, as we speak, of a test. Is the novelty market soaring? is novelty pouring into the system at a very fast rate? Now, some people thought that, the dead would rise on the 25th of February. That isn't how it works. Throughout the past couple of years, and I'm sure you are aware of it, we have been in a recidivist period in American politics and life, meaning a conservative era. And that has gotten more and more constipated and more self-congratulatory and more certain of itself, and hence odious. And I believe we've crossed over the cusp, and now that all is in a state of complete chaos and collapse. There are many things on the agenda for the next few months that could usher in enormous novelty, although novelty usually arrives in the form of the unexpected. In other words, the source of the novelty might be a return of communism to power in Russia, or it might be what else is scheduled? An American election is scheduled. An Israeli election is scheduled. It could be that the Chinese will attempt to grab Taiwan and create World War III. Misjudgment could lead that direction, but it could be positive. Novelty has no morality. An AIDS cure, what else can I think of along those? Well, some enormous technological breakthrough, star flight or cold fusion or something like that. I mean, these things lurk as possibilities, leaning into the continuum of space-time, always willing to be sucked into actualization if you can get the mojo right. So part of the briefing of a descent into novelty here is to ask and discuss the question, does it feel like we've come over a cusp? Does it feel like we're in a situation of increasing novelty day by day by day? This will last on into early June. And then if not, if we all get together in midsummer and agree it was kind of a dud, didn't really live up to expectations, well, then that's real data for looking at the time wave. People are confused sometimes by exactly who and what I am, and that's because in my personality, which is a humbler word than method, two things are united which are usually not found co-present. My techniques are all shamanic and involve perturbing the senses and dissolving ordinary states of mind through psychedelics. So my techniques are shamanic, but what would I call it? I guess method, not techniques, but method is rational and analytical. So I use shamanic techniques to go into shamanic places and then attempt to study them scientifically using reason. Say, what is this? How does it work? What is it made of? How do its parts relate to each other? And what is its inner dynamic? And this apparently, though it seems fairly obvious to me, is a fairly radical union of techniques. Scientists don't explore psychedelics because somehow the scientific mind must not be besmirched by contact and contamination with the thing studied. But how the hell can you study psychedelics without taking them? Rats are not very satisfying, and graduate students still less so. So eventually, you're going to have to get your feet wet. Well, then they say, well, but that destroys your scientific objectivity. Well, not if it's the only path to contacting the phenomenon that you're attempting to study. So that has worked for me. I am not part of the New Age in my own mind. To me, the New Age is typified by an incredible credulity and an utter immunity to cognitive dissonance. I mean, you can believe that the world is ruled from the Pleiades, and you can believe that L. Ron Hubbard is God. There seems to be no end to the number of contradictions that the New Age can simultaneously entertain. But what I have done is I probe weirdness. But rationally. Most people who are attracted to weirdness want to convert and believe it and take it in and exalt it. I don't. I don't want to believe anything. I hate ideology, all ideology. That's why I'm so casual about the possible crushing of my own, because ideologies are a lesser resolution of our dilemma than we are capable of. The higher resolution lies in real feeling and real community and affection. Ideology has poisoned the last 1,000 years. All of these ideologies have ultimately done more good and done more bad than good. Marxism, Christianity, even, at the risk of setting off a riot, Freudianism, on and on and on. The correct method, I think, is simply the phenomenological approach. Catalog data, seek patterns, draw conclusions, test them back against the original data. Now, most people who advocate that kind of an approach somehow come down. It brings them down. They say, well, this method then shows you that being is only this, and thought is only that, and love is merely this, and so forth. In other words, it reduces everything. It insults everything. I haven't found that to be the case. I've found real weirdness. The world is strange. Very, very, very strange. Not only, far stranger than I suppose, and orders of magnitude more strange than these cheerful workbench scientists and keepers of the faith of our culture suppose. There are doorways, there are edges, there are passageways. But for every real one, there are 10,000 dead ends, cul-de-sacs, and cheap scams of one sort. So to go out as an ingenue into the world seeking to invest your belief in something, you will be instantly sucked into some screwy thing and your life force pulled from you, and you will be used and abused, as ingenues and naives always are. A much better approach is, be tough. The truth does not require your participation in order to exist. Bullshit does. But the truth is fine, thank you, whether you believe in it or not. So what is gained by the truth if you believe in it? Nothing, I maintain. And you are diminished. You are diminished because by believing in something, you have precluded your freedom to believe in its opposite. You gave away the most precious existential currency in the universe. So, I think it's very good to be tough, to ask the hard questions, but to go a long way down the path with these claimants to secret knowledge, insight, lineage, but ultimately, the hard questions have to be asked. And this is not a path toward dispelling the mystery from the universe. This is the way to get to the real gold in a hurry, not become glamorized or subverted by the dross of the world. Well, maybe that's enough for this evening. We will go over all of these things at the level of intensity that you are interested in. It's fine to get down to the how much, how, and when questions about the compounds and the plants. That is technique, and that's important, because it's fine to sit here talking about the psychedelic experience. This bears no resemblance to the psychedelic experience in any form whatsoever. So it's very important that you leave here empowered, empowered to make your way into these places with confidence. And then the other thing to pay attention to is inevitably the way our ass-backward society works is it creates cults of personality and Renaissance stabilized points of focus on the celebrity personality who is the teacher, the guy who wears the microphone, or the woman who wears the microphone. What you can really take away from here, if you're smart, is community of some sort. Probably someone in this room has what you need. And I guarantee you it isn't me. So don't waste your time on me. But that's all there for you to sort out. So techniques we can discuss. The formation of community and association is your own business. And then as much time as you want to spend on the what does it all mean, Mr. Natural, side of the question. And we'll dig into all of this at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Get some sleep or go to the baths or do both. Or go to the rave. Okay, well, before I get into my spiel, does anybody have anything they want to say this morning which can range from have snorers in your room to some profound objection or illumination of what went on last night? Yeah.
Just a semantic question as to why descent into novelty rather than ascent into novelty. I mean, there seems to be a pejorative implied.
This question comes up. There are several reasons originally, and then I've invented new ones since. The time thing quantifies novelty, but it quantifies it, you could almost say it quantifies it negatively, because the maximum of novelty has a numerical value of 0. So how I pictured this was I actually picture the space-time continuum like a landscape, a topology. Well, then I think of time as a fluid medium of some sort. Well, naturally, a fluid medium finds its equilibrium at the lowest energy point in the system. So the river flows toward the sea. This question of energy flows and what is pejorative and what is not, I've learned, is a completely culture-based value. There are tribes in the Amazon for whom rivers begin where they meet another river, obviously, and they end where they peter out among some springs and swamps up in the mountain. To them, this is perfectly obvious that that's how rivers work. To us, it's inconceivable. The thing goes the other way. If I had turned the wave on its upside down, then instead of having maximum novelty quantify at 0, it would have simply quantified at some arbitrarily large integer in the 700,000 range. So it lacked elegance. So for all of those reasons, I chose to have novelty be a descent rather than an ascent. And then later I incorporated things like dynamics and chaos theory and that sort of thing into the model. Well, then what you get is sort of the idea that the 0 point in time is like a dwell point or an attractor. And so all the processes in the epigenetic landscape are being channeled, is one way to think of it, or pulled is another way to think of it, or pushed is another way to think of it, toward this certain point in the system. If that seems complicated, all I'm saying is if you release a marble up near the rim of a bowl, it's easy to predict where it's going to come to rest when it's still. It's going to come to rest at the bottom of the bowl. That's the place where the minimum energy of the system is fulfilled. Yeah. Okay, anything else out of last night? It's still possible to raise the issue of snoring. Don't feel we're so far from the dock that you can't jump back. Yes.
I have a friend who's been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and when Richard was here this week, he told me that ayahuasca is being found to be very good for Parkinson's. And if you know anything about that, I'd like you to talk about it.
I don't know anything about it except that I know who to ask, which would be my brother Dennis. But I've heard that this is true, that they're getting a remarkable remission of the symptoms with it. It's really part of a whole frontier, that Prozac has to do with, and I just a month ago went through a horrific series of migraines, and so now I know all about sumatriptan, which is a magic bullet for migraine, but a DMT-related drug that also, like Prozac and like ayahuasca, all of these things target these serotonergic systems, different 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors in the brain, and it seems like a whole new and much friendlier family of drugs are going to emerge out of this, and some of them are going to have application to psychological situations, and some are going to definitely impact stuff like migraine and Parkinson's. I don't know why it took them so long to look at the 5-HT family of receptors, because it's been pretty obvious to psychedelic heads for 30 years that of the major neurotransmitter systems in the brain, that seemed to be the one whose affects lie closest to observable consciousness. After I got out of here last night, I was reviewing my performance, and I realized that of the many descents into novelty that were indicated, the one which was left out, which is sort of the overarching architecture of the whole thing, is that life itself is a descent into novelty toward a complete singularity that defies all anticipation or is very difficult to come to terms with. People find it quirky that I would propose the end of the world, and they find it highly improbable and feel very good about being able to reject it as improbable. But have you noticed how abstract all that is in relationship to the inevitable fact of your own death? I mean, there is an end of the world built into your cosmology, the end of your world, which is, after all, the only world you know. So it may be that the planet will swing 100 billion times around the planet before the consummation of time. But that doesn't mean that you have permission not to contemplate final end states, because you've got an appointment with one out there somewhere, 10 minutes or 50 years in the future. So that little sobering parenthesis can be put around all of these other descents into novelty. The historical descent, the analogy to the historical descent produced by the psychedelic experience. And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about this morning, is maybe it isn't clear in everyone's mind what this historical acceleration and descent into complexity, what that might conceivably have to do with one's personal relationship to psychedelics. Well, it's hard to see the connection, I think, if you have a psychological model of what the psychedelic experience is. And by that I mean one school of thought about psychedelics is that it basically takes up the vocabulary of Freudianism and Jungianism and says there is a part of our mind which we are ordinarily not in contact with, which is composed of thwarted desires, unexamined memories, so forth and so on. And when we take psychedelics, somehow all boundaries are dissolved and we confront this material. And if it's traumatic, then the ordinary dynamics of psychotherapeutic curing cut in. And so this becomes a kind of catalyst for psychoanalysis of some form. So that's one model. And then another model is that this is a parallel world of some sort that we encountered. That's closer to what I'm proposing, but what I've come to rest with in this is a kind of mathematical model that consciousness, like certain chemical systems, has two states of crystallization. There is the mundane mind, which basically has evolved in a carnivorous hunting monkey as a threat detection device, and it is extraordinarily focused on nearby three-dimensional space and time because it's from there that some threat, an enemy, a saber-toothed tiger, something. And so the mind has evolved as an aura of threat detection around the body. But that is a kind of utilitarian application of it. In the same way that water takes the shape of any vessel that it's poured into, mind, too, is a kind of fluid and takes the shape of any vessel it's poured into. So in the ordinary circumstance of consciousness in three-dimensional space, consciousness fills the three-dimensional space-time continuum and returns a description of it to the animal body. But if you will still the body and remove the threat by posting guards at the front of the cave and moving back to where the furs, the women, and the children are, in other words, if you will raise your comfort level considerably and then take these chaotic substances, in other words, things which produce a perturbation in ordinary brain states, then the perturbation becomes a kind of energy that dissolves this threat detection architecture of consciousness. And within all that, there is the phoenix of hyperspace, which is what's called shamanic consciousness. And shamanic consciousness is not bounded by three-dimensional space and time and can move through the many levels of the universe at the speed of thought. And it is not a body-centered consciousness. Usually these states occur when, for all practical purposes, the body appears deeply asleep or dead. I mean, it's in trance. You're traveling. So mind is apparently a tool for the exploration of the dimensions that are built into nature. And what shamanism is, if you analyze it from this point of view, it becomes much more rationally apprehendable. Think about the classic characteristics of shamanism. Shamans are weather prophets. This is very important, to be able to predict the weather. Shamans can predict the movement of game And so they are directly linked into the nutrition, acquisition, survival equation of the human group that they represent. And shamans have incredible insight into if somebody's pilfering from somebody's food cache, the shaman can get right to the heart of this social problem and set it right. And then finally, shamans cure with quite impressive success rates in a world devoid of antibiotics, surgery, X-ray, and so forth and so on. They do very well. So all of this seems to verge on the edge of magic. They seem to have a different relationship to space, time, and energy than ordinary people. How do they do it? Well, if you imagine that the mind can unfold in a higher spatial dimension, then yesterday and tomorrow are no more distant than today. And all locked boxes have an open door in them. And all the end state of all processes in time can easily be discerned. So really what a shaman is someone with four-dimensional perception who carefully chooses their patients for recovery. And doctors will tell you part of being a good doctor is to know what patients to treat because there is an empathy there and there has to be a certain kind of linkage. So I don't think in principle there is a violation of physics involved. There is simply a violation or a broadening of the definition of what perception is. Well, then the question becomes how to reach these states. Yeah, Cheryl.
Well, this is a track that I think of often, like the mind assuming the shape of the vessel that it's put in. Because I deal a lot with people who are in the process of dying, who have lost the person that they love most in the world. So I deal with people that are really pushed up against the edge of the most traumatic experiences in their life. And what I find to be so rewarding and valuable about working with people in that state is that all the facades drop away, all the bullshit, all the defenses, and what's left is just this raw, core, pure essence of genuine being. And it makes me realize how unfortunately rare it is to encounter that. And you talk about getting safe from the tigers. I mean, we don't have tigers that we have to protect ourselves from, but dear God Almighty, we have so many other things that we're so involved in protecting ourselves from, that we've got these layers and layers and layers and layers of defense that keep us from being in touch with. I think those shamanic ways of being are our natural human resource that we all have. And the great sadness and the heartbreak for me is that we're so out of touch with it that we're wasting the greatest asset in being alive. And instead, we fill our minds with this absolute, dear God, drivel. I mean, don't we? I mean, what are the things that we think about most of the time? It's drivel. And, I mean, we're very lucky here. It's very pretty and everything's very nice and we can have pleasant conversation. But to really get to the core issues of what we're doing here and why we're here and what we could be using this experience for is such a contrast to me that I welcome this kind of conversation.
Well, see, the problem is, I think, that culture is a flight from reality.
Yes, it is.
All culture is a flight from reality. So to the degree that you are normal, whether you're Witoto or Manhattanite or Parisian, but to the degree that you are normal, that means you are very successfully taking part in the cultural flight from reality. You are supporting the mass hallucination and paying dues into it. And it's difficult in an age like now where there's so much stress on ethnicity and community and roots and all that, to preach this, to preach that culture is not your friend. It's a trap, it's a limit. But really, radical human freedom is what you were born for. And culture is a kind of placenta, which if you develop normally by around age 20, you have no need of it, and in fact you've recognized the toxic nature of it and are trying to put it behind you and get away from it.
That is the rationale for many people living in cities, in large, in virtual environments of steel and glass with no contact to the natural world, and their justification for that is, there's culture. Where else am I going to?
Good point. These are the same people who, when you suggest to them that their children watch too much TV, they say, but if they didn't watch TV, how would they learn about nature? These wonderful programs.
It's really funny that you have that take on the urban experience, because I've since August been recently thrown into the American urban experience of Manhattan. And what's so interesting to me is how many people I meet that say, well, I'm in Manhattan because I don't have to participate in culture. I'm in Manhattan because I can do my own thing and nobody cares, nobody pays attention. I'm not violating the community that I grew up with. I'm not violating my parents. I can get away with it.
You can be lost. In a sense, it's a kind of jungle.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, the word virtual was used here. Obviously, you're all aware there's a lot of ballyhoo now about virtual reality, and the critics of it say it will further artificialize and remove us from our roots. There is nothing new happening here except that we're going from stucco and steel and masonry to photons on a tube. When they built they were building a virtual reality, and when they all marched inside and closed the gates, they were inside a mental construction of human beings that was entirely artificial, and we've been there ever since. And all this computer revolution is a shift to more lightweight building materials. So the recovery of the natural state of human beings is, I think, somewhat chimerical. The only time you recover the natural state of human beings is in orgasm and in psychedelic apotheosis. And then, for fleeting moments, you recover it. And then you're dropped back down through levels and levels of culture, programming, obligation, matrix stuff. Matrix. Anyway, what I wanted to get to is then how to do this, how to get out of culture, how to get out of three-dimensional space, how to get into this super space. Well, there are two main methods on the table, and one is through, no matter how you cut it, some manipulation of the body. Maybe breath control, maybe diet, maybe extreme postures, maybe some sexual technique, could be mantra, etc., etc. And strangely enough, often unaccompanied by substances, plants, or drugs, but almost always accompanied by enormous doses of fuzzy thought and ideology, usually known as religion. So that there is that path, and the claim that you can achieve somehow the paradox of being outside without ever leaving culture by using the cultural instrument of religion to make your way to the heart of the mystery. I reject this. I just think it's bunk. It was something. It's an effort to close the loophole. It's an effort to channel spiritual thirst in a direction that is still culturally affirming. But spiritual thirst can't be culturally affirming because it's a rejection of culture. Culture generates spiritual thirst. Okay, so then the other method on the table are psychedelics. Arthur Rimbaud, the French symbolist poet, his theory of poetry was that it could only be achieved by what he called a deliberate dislocation of the senses. And some of you may have seen a couple of years ago a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker a bunch of businessmen sitting around a highly polished conference room table with a chart going down, down, down in the back, obviously the profits of the company. And the chairman of the board is saying to this little man who has obviously just said something, he's saying, "You're right, Higgins, that a deliberate disordering of the senses worked for Rimbaud, but would it work for us?" Probably not for Acme Corporation, but it will work for us. And the way it's achieved is by dissolving the chemical stability that lies behind the mental and cultural stabilities. In other words, going to a very deep level, going to the molecular architecture of the brain itself, and then making changes. And for reasons mysterious and certainly worthy of discussion, we are accompanied on this planet by dozens and dozens of plants that do this and do very little else. In other words, pose no problem to the physical integrity of the body or the long-term integrity of the culturally constructed normal mind, but which for minutes or hours dissolve the three-dimensional threat detector construct of the mind and replace it with something else. And then we can talk about what is the something else. William James said of the newborn infant, he said, "We are born into a blooming, buzzing confusion," which is a pretty good description of the first 30 seconds of a DMT flash. It's a blooming, buzzing confusion. Well, then is it simply that all reality is psychedelic, but if you spend enough time in any reality, it tends to mundanize? Is that it? And if you could be high on DMT for 4 years, at the end of it, you would navigate it the way a 4-year-old child navigates this world? Perhaps. Probably so, although possibly not. There might...
You come in with that kind of chaotic...
Yeah, we do. But when you burst into the DMT space, you don't arrive as the tabula rasa of the newborn infant. You arrive with your Husserl and your Pythagoras and all the rest of it fully intact in your hip pocket if you need to use it. Well, so long before written culture, long before cities, so forth and so on, this potential for the dissolving and recrystallizing of the mind through the use of plants had been discovered. It may have been one of the very earliest discoveries of human beings. And I believe, and argued in my book, Food of the Gods, that these things actually synergize high states of information processing and transfer, that spoken language itself is a kind of overflowing of the cup of thought into the verbal circuitry that is occasioned by pushing the human envelope with the presence of psychedelic compounds. And the way this works in a shamanistic society is most Aboriginal societies have located in their environment plants that are effective in causing this sort of state to occur. And these will be inevitably, with very few exceptions, indole-containing plants. All of the interesting psychedelics, with the exception of mescaline, which is an amphetamine, and alpha-salvinorin, which is, I believe, an isoquinoline, everything is an indole. LSD, DMT, psilocybin, ibogaine, and it's quite a small family. They are all serotonin antagonists, and they are all structural competitors for the bond site, the receptor site in the nervous system where all of this stuff goes on. I suppose we should talk, or at least mention the fact that the use of these things is illegal in most societies, and furiously suppressed in some societies. I don't find this very interesting. I just think it has to do with the suppression of most effective means for getting out of culture. Sex itself would be illegal if they could find a way to make it so. It obviously seems to threaten the social order as much as psychedelics. Well, so then if you're interested in these things beyond the mere abstract acquisition of data, then there's a lot of detail work ahead of you. You have to learn a lot about plants, a lot about Aboriginal cultures, a lot about chemistry, and a lot about yourself. And then you bring all this together and search for a tool that works for you. And, human beings are highly variable. I took a course years ago from Sasha, and there were about 500 people in this class. It was a class in forensic chemistry, of all things. And at one point, he brought in a test tube a little compound that was passed around and sniffed. And out of 500 people, 2 had a violent physical reaction to this stuff. And then he told us the range of sensitivity in human beings to this compound is over 3 orders of magnitude. And yet, so the person sitting next to you could be 10,000 times more sensitive to this chemical than you are. So you sort of have to learn the landscape of your own nervous system. Some people, there are powerful shamanic systems, for example, built on daturas, tropanes, the things that occur in Jimson weed, and these arborescent daturas that you see used in landscaping with the beautiful pendulous, fragrant flowers. Those contain powerful mind-altering substances. I can't take those things because I become delirious. It's a useless state to me. I become confused. And many people, that's their reaction. But maybe 1 in 50 has a different set of receptors for this and can hold presence and work through it. So you need to study the classic shamanic hallucinogen-using complexes in the world, and they are, without an effort to be exhaustive, the psilocybin complex in Mexico, based on many species of mushrooms occurring there, especially in the Sierra Mazateca, the ayahuasca complex in the Amazon basin, which is a combinatory thing made of 2 plants which synergize each other, the iboga complex in Western Africa, which runs on ibogaine, which is derivative of Tabernanthe iboga, the peyote complex of the American Southwest, and then arguably not a psychedelic, but since arguably we'll include it, the worldwide presence of the cannabis complex in different manifestations. So, and then, of course, the entire issue of synthetic chemistry. It's often been thought that I am some kind of monotheist about plants and denounce all synthetic chemistry. It isn't from some kind of absolute. It's simply that with synthetic chemistry, you don't have the kind of database you have with a plant. Take a plant, ayahuasca, probably been used 5,000 or 6,000 years. So we have our human data sample. We know that this doesn't cause blindness, miscarriage, birth defects, madness, so forth and so on. A drug fresh out of the laboratory that you've had a good response from 12 people with is by no means suddenly safe. I mean, tens of thousands of people have to take this drug for many years before you can absolutely certified. And the other thing to remember is no drug is safe. You can kill yourself with water if you drink enough of it. Drugs are poisons. This is what they are. And the question is, the judicious use of poisons elicits certain responses, but you definitely want to have this understanding. Well, so then there's a vast literature about all this, an anthropological literature, a chemical literature, and to some degree a philosophical and analytical literature. Reading all these descriptions, you eventually, something attracts you. And then the question is how to do it. And the way to do it, I think, especially in the beginning, is in silent darkness, on an empty stomach. You don't want to see the culture psychedelically, put through a psychedelic filter. You want to see the ding on siche of it, the thing in itself. So you just want to put a black and silent screen behind it. And people say, well, but won't it be boring? Having obviously meditated. No, it's not like that. People who are honest meditators will tell you that it's the most boring undertaking in the world, that somehow it's a metaphysic of boredom is what it is. But the way you do psychedelics is you sit and you close your eyes, but notice that when most people sit and close their eyes, they fall inward. They have closed their eyes, so why should they continue to look outward? But I think it's very important in the state of anticipation of the psychedelic, meaning before it comes on and as it comes on, to sit with eyes closed but looking. Simply imagine that there is a surface, a black surface, a foot in front of your face, and just watch it. And somehow this expectation of seeing is a permission to structures in the brain to begin to present. And then once, of course, the lock is made, it's often difficult to turn it off. But getting the channel tuned in right at the beginning can be tricky. And all the techniques of unpsychedelic spiritual pursuit work in the presence of psychedelics. In my experience, it's the only time they work. So in other words, pranayama, yantra, mantra, suddenly these things become as advertised rather than, I've said it 10,000 times, I'm not sure I'm getting anywhere. So I think it's very good to imbibe these knowledge of these spiritual techniques and have your mantras folded and ready at your elbow when you plunge in there. Yeah.
A small digression. What about shamanic cultures?
This is an interesting question. And in anthropology, it's been a raging debate for 30 years or more. The definitive work on shamanism, or the great classic work on shamanism, is called Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy by Mircea Eliade. And Eliade was a Romanian who educated in France and became a brilliant academic, wrote one of the best books ever written on yoga, immortality, and freedom. Wrote a book that changed my life forever called Cosmos and History. Many, many books, a great historian of religion. But when Eliade came to the phenomenon of intoxication in shamanism, he completely reverted to his European constipated male dominator French structuralist roots, and he said narcotic. This was the word he used, which noticed the pharmacological imprecision of that. That right there tells you this person doesn't quite at the front of the line. But he said narcotic shamanism is decadent. Resort to drugs is decadent. Well, then Gordon Wasson, who was the discoverer of the mushroom complex, took exactly the opposite position and said shamanism, in the absence of psychoactive plants, is on its way to turning into ordinary priestcraft and religion. And in my experience, this is true. I mean, I agree with Wasson for the following reason. There is nothing intrinsically to be valued, I think, in suffering. I'm Buddhist enough to believe that there's enough suffering without inviting or creating it. So when you lay the psychedelic path next to the non-psychedelic but effective path, it's an ordeal. That's how it's done. You starve yourself, you go into the wilderness, you pierce yourself. You may, in fact, take plants that are not psychedelic, but that induce severe cramping or diarrhea or something like that. You may be flagellated. You may be covered with red ants. You may be hung upside down. You may be beaten senseless. I mean, clearly, to my mind, what this evinces is a kind of desperation to attain these states. Almost no price is too great. And, you start shedding blood in a tropical environment, and you're up for grabs for severe septicemia and all sorts of things. So it's a very heavy thing. Meanwhile, these plants, you prepare the concoction, you take it. There may be a little gastric distress. There may be a little psychological distress. But no matter how bad it gets, 6 to 12 hours later, you're able to tell the story around the campfire. And you have smoothly, cleanly cut to the center of the mandala and returned. So I think if we are saying that entry into the shamanic world is to be achieved by technique, and all scholars of shamanism agree with this, well then as you lay these techniques side by side, clearly the use of hallucinogenic plants is more sophisticated in the sense that we judge a Maserati to be more sophisticated than a coach and four. It simply goes faster, works smoother, is more comfortable, and gets you there in better shape. Now, some cultures are in the unfortunate position, not many, but some, of having no really effective hallucinogen in their cultural area. And in almost every case, they have found a way. And people will go to great lengths. I'm sure, as you know, an example of both a poor, in my mind, a poor, although there are people who would rise up in holy wrath over this, but the Amanita muscaria cults of western Siberia among the Tunguska and Kamchatka people. I've taken Amanita muscaria. I know many people who've taken it. It's an extremely trying experience at best. And I don't think you could build a religion of ecstasy around it unless you were in a desperately sensory-deprived environment with no other intoxicants available. To support my argument, the Amanita cults collapsed almost immediately upon contact with vodka. And so, in other words, in the minds of these Siberian shamans, these two vehicles laid side by side, their traditional mushroom and vodka was to be preferred. People have made much of Amanita muscaria, but even its most enthusiastic proponents admit that they could never get off. So that's a severe mark against one of these things. They must be effective. One of the things that has held up the development of this field, I briefly mentioned it yesterday, was the unwillingness of researchers to experience these things. To go and live with an Aboriginal people and see that every new and full moon they take something and the whole society goes through changes, and then they talk of nothing else until the next time they take it, and this is what they live for, and you're studying their language and their value system and all this, and you don't do it. it makes no sense at all. And yet, until very recently, if you were to do it, your colleagues back at Miss Atomic University would whip their knives out and denounce you as unprofessional, going back to the bush, not good method, so forth and so on. So there's been an enormous phobia about contacting this by academics, and so it's been left to countercultures, to fringe people, to individual experimenters, to eccentrics of various types. And in the underground, then, an enormous database has been built up. Nobody knows as much about psychedelics as people in the underground, because they're the people who've actually taken them, correlated the data, and kept track of it. So we have an official science of pharmacology, and then we have this oddly developing subculture. And, it used to be, 10 years ago, I suppose, that a genuine shaman was a person in a traditional culture ministering to the needs of a tribal group somewhere. Now, there are a large number, I don't know, thousands of people who I consider full-fledged shamans and full-fledged members of cyber-electric culture. I mean, shamanism is not necessarily a phenomenon of the upriver and off-road. So there are people who have all the tools of Western science and epistemology. They've been to Harvard, they've studied philosophy and science and all mathematics, and they are fully empowered with the tools of archaic shamanism. They've been to these places. And strangely enough, in many cases, these are some of the most creative people in the culture. I mean, I don't think he would mind me mentioning him in this context. Somebody like Mark Pesce, who is, a full-on psychedelic techno-pagan and the genius who created VRML, which is going to let us all walk into cyberspace. High-tech and shamanic cultures are almost overlapping in this country. And I think it has to do with the fact that, and this is what I mentioned last night, talking about the toxicity of ideology, that we're moving into a post-ideological world. We're moving into a world where the bankruptcy of ideology is obvious. All ideologies are faiths. Even science can be demonstrated to be a faith that rests on certain revealed truths which are never questioned. To build a non-toxic future, we are going to simply have to solve many of our problems pragmatically. For instance, right now, we have many problems. AIDS, overpopulation, this and that. All of these problems could be solved, except that we have one rule when we approach a problem. The solution must make money. There are many problems where there is no solution that makes money. So if you refuse any solution but that type, you're upriver. Well, anyway, that's a slight digression.
Terence,
Yeah, sure. Lead me back.
However, I will say that there are a few on my bookshelf, and that's a horrible way to do it. And I agree with you. I really agree with you. But there are a few on my bookshelf. Franklin Merrill Wolf would be one. Gopi Krishna would be another. Yogananda, from people that I've met that spent time with him, might be a third. I feel better about the first two. There are people in history that really seem to be beatific.
Well, Aldous Huxley said a very interesting thing about psychedelics, and I think it addresses this. He said of psychedelics, he said, it is a gratuitous grace. Now, what does this mean? It means it is neither necessary nor sufficient for salvation. It is neither necessary nor sufficient for salvation, but it certainly helps. It's so taking psychedelics doesn't make you a superior person. This interests me very much because I've now been at this for 30 years. And your original question, are we better people, fascinates me. Because if we are not better people for doing this, then we're just another cult. We're like the Mormons or Shokoa Sahara, or it's just we have this closed system of belief. We do this thing. We say it makes you better. It's no different from Ladihan or Mantrayana or some other practice. It's just our practice is fairly radical, and we claim it makes us better people.
Well, yeah, and what I'm saying is, rather than take the thing in itself and say, does this make us better or not? What is the set of to-dos that does make us better? What is that set? How do we do that? What's the manual look like?
Well, my argument in favor of that it does make us better, and here's how, is that love is obviously the highest human ideal. I mean, that's like a cliche to say that, but love is the highest human ideal. Well, love consists, it seems to me, largely of boundary dissolution. That we merge with the thing loved. We soften our boundaries, and of course, male primate sexuality has to do with penetration and all sexuality except some fish. Usually, there's some sharing of space and so forth. Well, these psychedelics, in that sense, then, are inherently amorous or inherently sexy, because that's what they do. They dissolve boundaries between you and other people and other things. And as a primate, when the boundary is dissolved, what you feel is love. Or if you're traumatized by bad upbringing and childhood abuse and who knows what, when the boundaries dissolve, what you feel is fear. But if you are not damaged, the proper response is love. And I think through the psychedelics, if you have fear, and we all do, believe me, because it's terrifying to shed the old carapace. But beyond the fear lies the love, if you can persist through it. And so really the demand that psychedelics make on us, and this may be another reason why perhaps we tend to be better people, that's all I would say, is psychedelics demand of us courage. Every single person who says they've done psychedelics several dozen times is a courageous person. You're standing in the presence of fearlessness, because otherwise people turn away from it. And I think courage is probably a good value, probably makes you a good person to hike in the woods with or have an affair with or whatever. So it makes us courageous, and it dissolves boundaries which let in love or fear. And the fear that they let in can be transformed in the psychedelic state through an inner alchemy into love. That's why, the most dramatic personality transformations I've ever seen, including my own, have been psychedelically induced and just happen on the dime. You go into it per se, and 12 hours later you come out and you are not that. It doesn't always work like that. But nothing else ever works like that. So, and speed seems to expand people's tolerance for sexual activity that they would ordinarily refuse. They will accept under speed. So these compounds change our sexual values around, and a society using psilocybin on a regular basis would dissolve this male dominance hierarchy and replace it, I think, with the glue of an orgiastic and more egalitarian system. And for a long, long time, we lived like that. And in that period, when we lived like that, language, music, compassion, love, all the higher values emerged. Well, then, at some point, and for complicated reasons not necessary to discuss, unless you want to, the mushrooms disappeared. And the chemical fix that had been in place for thousands and thousands of years that was suppressing this older male-dominant style of behavior just drained out of the system. And suddenly, men were very interested in controlling women's behavior, and the orgies were canceled, and the levels of anxiety began to rise, and people began to think in terms of turf and property and my children and my food. And in short, the hideous union of the animal and the spiritual that we meet in ourselves came into being. We are like the inheritors of a dysfunctional childhood or something. Something terrible happened to all of us in our past. For 100,000 years, we were at our most human, without material culture, living in a world of magic and song and sexuality and husbandry, living lightly on the land, herding cattle in the presence of mushrooms. This seems to be, that was the climax of the pre-technical phase. Well, then agriculture changed all that, created surpluses, ended nomadism, provided a raison d'etre for cities. The return of male dominance ended in god kings and standing armies. And then, we've had 5,000 years of this now, 6,000, 7,000, whatever, and we're at the end of our rope. The planet is at crisis. Our politicians are clueless. Divine intervention is our best hope, either from flying saucers or the second coming or something. And in the presence of so much obvious, overwhelming difficulty, people are turning more and more toward irrational faiths and just waiting for the Space Brothers to pull us out of this mess.
His penis was starting to shrink.
Oh, yeah. Well, to quote a Grateful Dead song, you can't go back and you can't stand still. If the thunder don't get you, then the lightning will. This thing was set in motion 100,000 years ago, and now we are caught in the consequences of our forebears' stupid decisions or brilliant decisions, whatever. But we're being forced through. I mean, I agree that there's a lot of Q force building up in the society. In other words, vibration. It's almost like as you try to push an airfoil through the sound barrier, as you approach hypersonic velocity, the thing begins to shake. And if it hasn't been correctly designed, the wings will tear off. But if it has been correctly designed, the Q force will maximize and then very suddenly plummet, and that's called breaking the sound barrier, and you're through. It's very clear that this culture is revving up to attempt the leap into hyperspace. And it's either going to succeed, and we will become unrecognizable to ourselves and scatter through the galaxy as motes of light, or we will fail, and probably biology will cancel the R&D division on intelligent life and go back to ground squirrels, chipmunks, and monarch butterflies. That's worked so well for so long. Yeah.
I understand a little bit the physics idea of matter seeking some sort of organization and then seeking a disorganization, and kind of the back and forth ebb and flow. And it makes me wonder about computers and the internet and the World Wide Web, how now we're trying to structure ourselves in something that seems to be going against the human grain. And
why do you think it goes against the human grain?
Well, it's artificial.
Well, we invented artificiality. I mean, I don't disagree with you. Somebody pointed something out to me recently that I find very interesting. They pointed out that in a cubic inch of forest soil, there's about 11,000 miles of mycelial wiring. Now, we're building something called the Internet and furiously laying copper and fiber optic everywhere, and soon it will go wireless. I think that this net that we're building is not the most artificial construction ever conceived. It's a simulacrum of nature, is what it is. Nature is the original Internet. I mean, nature is some kind of interconnected, communicating, data routing, self-regulating, non-equilibrium system. And as we go nanotech, as we descend to the molecular level, our teachers are going to be plants, viruses, bacteria. They know how to do it down there, and we don't. And I think that the artificial phase of technology is simply that, a phase. Remember in Arthur C. Clarke's book, The City of and the Stars, the central dictum of that society, and it had been a rule followed for 1,000,000 years, was no machine shall have any moving part. And that's coming. And those are machines we can barely imagine, and they will be, smaller than a gnat's eyelash. So the artificial natural thing seems to me a synthetic dualism. In fact, all dualisms are synthetic because, at least in my book, there is some kind of Neoplatonic one that lies behind all the lesser understandings that give us category. Well, I think, what nature teaches and what life teaches is that worry is preposterous. Worry is a form of egomania, because in order to worry, you have to assume you understand the situation. What are the odds that you actually do understand the situation? Very low, I would think, and the more abstract the worry, I'm worrying about, Ratko Mladic, and he's running around free over there in a country I've never seen. Now, is this a sane thing for me to be worrying about? I don't think so. Worry is preposterous, and how I've understood that is I'm not a fatalist or a predestination person. Predestination is preposterous because if the world is absolutely predestined, then you think what you think because you couldn't think anything else. That makes the quest for truth somewhat pointless. In order for there to be truth, there has to be error. Otherwise, how would we know truth? So, well, that's probably enough on that. Yeah.
I think maybe the last couple of comments and then my own are positing a third way, which is not the technique of these ascetic practices in religion or even psychedelics, but more a way of being in which one is open and receptive to the incredible patterns that exist within life and within wilderness. And maybe this is the shamans who don't need psychedelics are able to contact that. And my own experience in providing a very safe experience for myself alone with a great deal of solitude in wilderness is that things happen which are absolutely magical. And it seems to come out of my willingness to play and to imagine and to love the things in my environment. And that's a little bit what you're talking about with your experience. And I would like that to be considered as a viable way of achieving the unity and the love of these of life that you're talking about.
Well, the key thing I think in what you said was to be open and aware. it's harder for some people than others, but psychedelics certainly make it easier. I mean, it makes it simply, like with LSD in wilderness, what I found is it simply makes it possible to sit still an unearthly amount of time. And that's all you have to do for it all to go on. As soon as you disappear into the landscape, then stuff begins to happen. I mean, amazing things go on. I sat once on a beach in Asia, stoned on LSD, and a little crab came along and cleaned my fingernails. Every one of them. It just moved from fingernail to fingernail, and it had this little claw, and it etched them out, and it took a long time, and I was just like this, and it would climb down one finger, go out to the other one, finish, go down here, and only Buddha or LSD can give you that kind of power to sit still.
I think it's, and maybe I've misunderstood people, but I think it's a really weird construct to dichotomize humans from nature. We don't say that ants or the termites have separated themselves up from nature by building a termite hill, which is a really good skyscraper for termites. And why all of a sudden when man goes out and builds a skyscraper and puts himself in it, he no longer participates in nature? It seems so strange to me. I mean, because we're in a terrarium. Well, it's not like we can go leave. It's just
we have.
It's such a weird thing to me to say that if you do certain things, sitting on the rock is in nature. Sitting at the top of the World Trade Center is not. I mean, we can't judge that. We can't judge it. It just seems so strange to me.
Well, there's a categorical difference that people sense but can't always articulate. And what it is nature is a genetic machine of some sort. Everything is under the control of genes, except that when you get to human beings, there are these things called epigenetic behaviors. In other words, how you make a Chevrolet is not written into the DNA of human beings. The anthill is a genetic program, but what we are is freakily out of control of our genetic heritage. We don't behave like automata. We speak many languages. That's unheard of. A species which has localized communication systems. And yet that's how we do it. There is no human universal way of communicating. We've culturally fragmented that. Pardon me? Have local dialects? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, see, I think and I don't want to get into huge arguments with you, but there's
Oh no, don't be shy.
Different tribes of gorilla crack nuts differently. Okay? I mean, it's not just a human characteristic. There are some that use a rock and a log, and they put the nut in the log and they crack it. And there are other gorillas that can't crack nuts, and there are other gorillas. I mean, just because something is epigenetic does not mean it's a part of nature. Right?
No, I agree with you, but I say people sense this difference. It would be quite astonishing if there were no epigenetic behavior outside of human beings. That would indicate it was some kind of descent from above. But I think when nature is fully understood, there will be no dramatic transitions. Everything is anticipated, everything is sort of, it begins as a theme and then rises to dominate the orchestra. The other and more exciting possibility is that we are entirely under the control of higher order genetic programming, and that history is a genetic process that has a purpose, and that it is like gestation or fruition or something, and that a good example to have in your intellectual toolbox is the slime mold. Slime molds are these organisms which have a very peculiar life cycle. let's cut in at a random point in their life cycle, and what we find are amoeba-like creatures, almost microscopic, living in the soil, the decaying leaves and stuff of the forest floor. They look like single-celled amoeba. But at a certain point, one of these individual amoeba undergoes some kind of stimulus. It's not well understood, and it begins to emit a chemical signal which says, "Come to where I am." And these amoeba, which may be spread out over a few square yards of the forest floor, they all begin to congregate at this spot where this chemical signal is being broadcast from. And as they arrive by the millions, the original cell and the first arrivals on the scene are literally lifted into the air by the arrival of millions and millions of individuals, and this thing forms, which is a couple of inches long and has a pointed stalk on it. And now we're looking at a macrophysical organism with a weight in grams, and it then sporulates and bursts, and these spores spread out through the air and descend to the forest floor and become these free-living amoeboid things, and the whole cycle starts over again. So what is this? Is this an animal that is dissolved into its cells at one stage of its existence? Or is it millions of animals that at one stage of their existence aggregate together to form something roughly analogous to a human city? I prefer the former explanation. It seems to me that, and we are like that, and history could well be a process like that. Something is torn loose in our species having to do with information processing and coding, and we literally have a symbiotic relationship with the word. And Western civilization begins, in principio et verbum et verbo caro factum est. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word is made flesh. So we're like the carriers of this strange relationship to a logos, a kind of mind that doesn't seem to be made of matter, but that seems to permeate this planet. And various cultures contact this on various levels. I mean, this is the spirit world of the shaman. This is the logos world of the Greek golden age, so forth and so on. And some societies call it God, and some call it Gaia, and some call it illusion. But all societies are aware of it as a potential experience. I think history has a purpose, and that the obvious no way backness of it indicates that it is some kind of process that it is designed. It is not a random walk. It's not the accumulation of endless blunders. It actually has a purpose and an intent, and it's a style. And when it is fulfilled, it will be replaced by something else. Yeah, do you all understand? The meme is kind of, you could say it's the basic, if genes are the basic units of biology, memes are the basic units of ideology and culture. So fascism is a meme. Madonna is a meme. All ideologies and all short-term cultural phenomena are memes, and these memes compete. Whatever happened to Boy George? That kind of thing, Apparently, some go extinct, and they can be replicated. I mean, when you repeat my opinion, it means you have copied the meme, in the same way that you could copy a gene. And when I write a book, I am replicating my inner memes and sending out thousands of copies, somewhat analogous to a virus. And so inside society, these memes are competing. That's what Buchanan means when he talks about cultural war. It's the meme war that he's talking about. Shall we be white, Christian, upright, rectitudinous human beings, or shall we be dope-smoking, homoerotic, blah, 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 blah. These are all memes. And as you said very well, they compete. And the human world is an environment in which these memes compete. And hopefully over time there is some kind of maximization of something. I don't want to say progress, although casually people speak of progress, like we're supposed to believe that Heidegger is somehow has a deeper insight into reality than, I don't know, I wouldn't say Plato. That I don't think there's been progress there. But who? What?
No, I said please don't.
Was a bad example. The psychedelic meme is a perfect example. I mean, that's a very strong, coherent, definable meme. It's been furiously suppressed, but continues to survive. It's a healthy meme. It's able to infect rapidly and spread through populations, and somehow they accrue some benefit to it, and so it's preserved. I don't know how we got off on this. Anybody else? Anything else? We still haven't really gotten to what I planned to talk about this morning, and we're almost done. That's a good sign. Well, it was basically just to make sure you're fully up to speed on the psychedelic options available. No pun intended. For example, if you have a problem with the illegality of some of these substances, then alpha salvinorin or salvia divinorum is a new plant and a new compound on the scene, not scheduled, not illegal, perfectly okay to grow, possess, advocate, give people, so forth and so on, and quite radical dislocation of the senses, in Rimbaud's phrase, occurs with this. It also has some interesting technical aspects to it, the most impressive being it's active at the 1 milligram level, 1,000 micrograms of this stuff, and it's smoked. So this is a 1 milligram smokable psychedelic that knocks the pins out from under you pretty dramatically for about 45 minutes. The leaf can be chewed, the plant can be grown as a house plant, so forth and so on. So that's one option that's available. The other thing you might... Salvia divinorum, yeah.
I'm growing some. Somebody gave me a plant. And so what do I do with it? How do I...
If you just want to take the leaf, get some big leaves, and there's some controversy about how much you need or whether a lot is more than a little. But anyway, I took 35 grams. But it was a huge mouthful, I must say. So try 20 grams and weigh it, remove the mid-vein so it loses volume, roll it up into a package and shove it in your mouth and lie down in darkness and slowly squeeze and chew it in order to expel this juice into your mouth and lie still. And after about 15 or 20 minutes, you'll see what's called streaming, violet blobs of light sliding past your eyes. You see this after orgasm sometimes, and you see it in anticipation of psychedelics often. So that will happen. And about 3 minutes after that, it becomes dramatically visionary and quite bizarre. I mean, on a par with DMT, these stretching, sucking, liquid things, and very bright, the hallucinations. And interesting to me, I've never had this with any other compound. I was sitting in darkness in a house with a big pyramidal skylight and the moonlight shining in. The perfect circumstance for hallucinating with eyes open, sharp edges against darkness. Eyes open, there was absolutely nothing going on. I would close my eyes, and it was as dramatic as turning on a light. It was that quick. There was no transition. It was just I would close my eyes, and here would be these slowly undulating three-dimensional tunnels and recessional surfaces and stuff. So I find it quite fascinating. And then to the chemist, it's extremely fascinating because it's in a class of compounds unknown to contain psychoactive compounds. Well, now they're going back into it, and with liquid CO2 chromatography, very cold solvent chromatography, which is very precise and non-destructive, they're finding a whole family of these salvanorine compounds. And what this will lead to in terms of psychedelics, treatments for mental illness, who knows, It's amazing that 30 years, 40 years into the psychedelic revolution, we would discover not a new compound, Sasha does that 3 times a week, but a new family, a new chemical family with psychoactivity. That's a new continent in the world of neuropsychopharmacology. And then the other thing that people are doing that is very shamanic and challenging and good thing to do is, you probably all know about ayahuasca, this South American combinatory thing where a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, Banisteriopsis caapi, is combined with a source of tryptamine, DMT, usually Psychotria viridis. And because of the MAO inhibition in the gut, the tryptamine, which would normally be destroyed at that point, it passes through into the bloodstream and then passes the blood-brain barrier. So you can make DMT orally active if you complex it with an MAO inhibitor. Well, a whole bunch of people have realized that in most environments in the world, there are tryptamine sources. And so if you could combine them with an MAO inhibitor, you could create local variants on Amazonian ayahuasca. And they call this pharmahuasca, or anahuasca, meaning analog ayahuasca. And what people are doing is they're using Pagamen harmala as the MAO inhibitor, the seeds of Pagamen harmala. These are little black seeds, and you can get them from seed companies, or you can get them at Iranian markets, and they call it hurmal. And it's sold in Iranian markets to be thrown on hot charcoal to fumigate rooms. I mean, this is just a traditional use of it. It kills fleas. It's a very nice smelling thing and a kind of an incense. Well, if you take 2 grams of these little black seeds and grind them down, that will inhibit your MAO very effectively. And now, any DMT-containing plant that you orally ingest will become active. And it turns out that DMT is very, very common in nature. It's the commonest of all hallucinogens in nature. It occurs in numerous grasses, in leguminous trees. It occurs in the Rubiaceae. It occurs in the Myristicaceae. On and on, huge families implicated in this. It even occurs in certain species of fish. It occurs in human metabolism. This is interesting. A Schedule I drug that you are carrying around in your body, every man, woman, and child on this planet. Kind of the ultimate catch-22. Everybody is breaking the law. You must have realized that anyway. So these things can be complex together. Now, some of the DMT sources that you might want to be aware of are phalaris grasses. These are prairie grasses, and some of these strains are pretty stiff. Red turkey is a strain of Phalaris arundinaceae that is pretty potent. There's a plant called Desmanthus illinoiensis, the Illinois bundleweed, which apparently was not used by the North American Indians. It's only been about 4 years that it has been discovered that the root bark of this plant is intensely contains DMT. And wildcrafters are now collecting it, and you can buy that plant. If you go to Mexico, there's a material sold in Mexican pharmacies called tepescohuite, which is the root bark of Mimosa hostiles, the same plant implicated in Brazil in a cult of a drug called vino de jarema. That is a very mysterious and not well understood DMT preparation taken orally, apparently without an MAO inhibitor. Or the MAO inhibitor must also be present in the single plant from which it's prepared. Other sources of DMT, Lespedeza bicolor, that's a clover-like ground cover. Those are probably the main ones. So people are experimenting with these things and making pharmawaska, and in some cases getting off. I mean, there's a lot of clenched guts and hanging over the porcelain bowl in this line of research, but if you hit it right, you'll be very gratified. Yeah, well, that's the great thing about having an underground. You get human data that you could never get in a situation of government licensing because people are willing to take chances. I had a real bummer one time. I took half a dose of mushrooms and half a dose of ayahuasca. And it had me praying for mercy. It was not like anything I've seen some weird territory. But what this was apparent, as I analyzed it later, what must have been happening was short-term memory simply was not transcripting. And so I was sitting there, stoned out of my mind, and then this thought would come, something's wrong. Something's wrong. So then I would search through pulse, heartbeat. Nothing's wrong. You say, oh, nothing's wrong. Okay. And you go back to the trip. 15 seconds later, something's wrong. You say, nothing's wrong. And it got loopier and loopier. And I remember that amazing scene in 2001 where the guy is outside the ship and he says, open the pod door, Hal. And he says, I can't do that, Dave. And I had this image of the molecular machinery jammed. I could almost see it. I could see the molecule locked in the synaptic receptor cleft, and it was like, and it was building toward panic. And I somehow got hold of myself. And I had a picture, which I'm sure you've all had this picture, of myself in a locked ward somewhere. They check in once every 36 hours and wash down the walls. I just said, I'm just going to sit here until it leaves. And I did. And after about an hour of real hell, you could just almost feel it click and begin to drift out of the receptor, and then the pharmacokinetic dynamics of the thing cutting. Said, oh, we're going to live to tell the tale, apparently. Yeah.
There is a wildflower that grows in spring in fields in California that I don't know the name of it. Those little purple flowers, and if the plant's allowed to continue to grow, it becomes a woody stem, green leaf, sort of a sage green, with a stem of little purple flowers. I'm sure some of you must know what it is. They also come occasionally in yellow. When I walk through a field of those, I smell DMT. I know that DMT is there somewhere, but I have no idea.
I'm sure you're right. I mean, there's a yellow flowering tropical bahania in a bot garden near where I live in Hawaii, and the smell it just rivets you when you walk by. And many times I've been in the Amazon, walking along a trail in the late afternoon, and suddenly it will just hit you. And strangely enough, smell is an incredibly imprecise sense. Standing in a jungle, smelling a strange smell and asking the question, what makes this smell? There are thousands of sources, you look around, you have no idea. But yeah, I think it occurs as a volatile in flowers, as some kind of an attractant. It has a sweet, sharp, indolic smell that's very piercing. Yeah. Syrian rue is Pagamen harmala. That plant I mentioned as the source of an MAO inhibitor. If you're interested in doing experiments, becoming a shaman/alchemist and experimenting with making your own pharmawaska, get Jonathan Ott's book called Ayahuasca Analogs. I think they have some copies here. And he describes his self-experiments, and it's a little book, very useful. It's very satisfying, I might say, to make your own stuff. I mean, I wrote a book with my brother years ago called Psilocybin, the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. Growing it is really a wonderful experience. I mean, I don't want to advocate it absolutely, because you could be dragged away to the can for years. There's that little detail. But absent that, the way you experience the organism when you grow it is incredible, because you you take a $25 sack of rye, a human food, that's all it is. You buy it at the organic grocery. It's a human food. You take it home. You have this snowy white mycelium. It's this pure, it's a symbol of purity, its whiteness. And it will convert it 12% dry weight into Teononacatl, the flesh of the gods, the doorway into the mysterium. And so it gets you out of the cycle of criminal syndicalism that inevitably accrues to fancy dope dealing. You have produced it. You know every stage of its unfoldment, and you have a very strong relationship with it. The other thing is, growing mushrooms teaches all kinds of virtues which serve you very well while tripping. Virtues like constancy, attention to detail, patience, so forth and so on. So if you're wondering if you should take mushrooms and you're really in a dilemma about it, grow them. If you can grow them, you can take them. I mean, that is the certain entry into it. And of course, there's a certain mystical faith that we who grow are somehow more deeply in the service of this thing than those who simply trip. That's probably bullshit, but it keeps us at the knife and the flame.
There's sort of a papa-mama feeling about it, bringing them little kids up. And
well, when you see a large mushroom project go into fruiting, it's awesome. It's awesome. The power of this thing, what a workhorse this organism is. This thing, it's so efficient. I mean, imagine 12% conversion of rye to psilocybin. To put that in perspective, that $25 bag of rye becomes $35,000 6 weeks later at current market prices. I mean, not to bring the mundane in here, but there's nothing wrong with feeding your children either, and staying off welfare and so forth and so on. Did you want to say something? Did you want to say something? No.
Terence, how much trouble how much irritation have you had from the government because of your public stand and you're easily identified and all that sort of thing?
Well, now this will be a hard swallow for all of us, because the great faith of our culture is that paranoia is never inappropriate. None. Ever. I don't know what that means. I'm paranoid enough to assume it must mean I work for them. How else could that be possible? The other possibility is that they are even stupider than we suppose. I mean, I used to say, I just use big words, that's all. They don't clock that. It never appears on their screen. Another possibility, which is equally humbling to all of us, is that this isn't worth bothering with. Some freewheeling Irish bullshit artist and his docile flock. Who cares, I sort of have the idea that there's something called the 5% rule, and it's that you can believe anything, advocate anything, practice anything, and as long as you don't gain adherence of greater than 5% of the population, you do not become a budgetary item for repression unless you start gassing subway stations or murdering judges or something, and then, of course, you have to be dealt with.
But it is effective. I worked as a paramedic for 5-6 years, and we get Tylenol overdoses. And the sad thing about it is most people are making cries for help, thinking, no, it's just Tylenol. They'll be able to do something for me, and they can't. It's scary stuff.
Lots of Prozac admissions.
That's interesting. Well, Prozac is a very peculiar drug in the sense that it never seems to work the same way twice. I'm not sure. I think timing is very important with Prozac. I really think Prozac hasn't been understood. It's being used to treat depression. I think what it is it's the magic bullet for, what is it called? Seasonal light deficit syndrome. I just think we are not supposed to be living this far north, and that every year we go through a culturally managed depression called winter or holidays. And people say, why do I feel like shit? And there are a million reasons, but the real reason is because you're not in the tropics, dude. And I took Prozac in the past, and the feeling when everything was stripped away, I said, what is this feeling that this drug gives me? It's the feeling that it's summertime. Your body tells you that it's the good old summertime. And, your body likes being told that. I think it's terrible. I live in Hawaii, and so I'm very aware every September the media, of course, has a totally mainland cast. And so every September, say, the media starts talking about how, well, summer's over now, we're all going back to school, and the sports are changing, and everything is changing. And you can just feel in the tone, they're fixing them all over there. They're getting them ready for another winter. And I just channel surf. We don't need to be hyped about how, well, it's another winter coming. So I think a lot of people are depressed in the wintertime, and Prozac, and of course it's targeting serotonin reuptake, and serotonin, this is not air, serotonin has a complex light-mediated chemistry in the pineal. This is all about light, strangely enough, this serotonin deep pineal hydroxytryptamine chemistry. Melanin, which gives you your suntan, is a further breakdown product of melatonin, which is a conversion from serotonin to melatonin that goes on in the pineal, mediated by a harmine-like enzyme called adenosine by the physiologists, but called by the chemists 6-methoxytetrahydroharmalan. And there is actually a part of the optic pathway that breaks off and carries physical light into the center of your brain in order to drive this pineal chemistry. That's why light and depression are so dramatically linked. I mean, there's actually a lot, light actually gets into your pineal gland and there mediates certain chemical processes. Well, the morning has fled, as they always do. Enjoy your afternoon. We'll be back here at 4, and if you don't like the way this is going, come armed with questions and agendas. Thank you.
If anybody wants to talk about the...
So I hope you're enjoying Esalen and making good use of your time one way or another. This evening we'll talk about the time wave. I see the computer is in the room, so assuming we can get it up and running, we'll talk about that. Before I get started this afternoon, I want to give you my URL so that you can find the website. The website is really my substitute for myself, and I'm trying to make it more interesting than I am by far. And I've only been at it a year, but it's already up over 15 megabytes and growing. And the idea is that if I have some enthusiasm, I put it on the website, and then even though my interests may wander elsewhere and I no longer care about reform in the Seychelles or something else, it's there in its pristine form, spell-checked, illustrated, hair-combed. That's the way we want to be seen. So, and there are many, many pointers to everything from developments in AI to pharmacology to nasty pictures, because it's a huge website. So if some part of what is touched on here, physics, mathematics, chemistry, sociology, you want to follow up, go to the website, and there will be a button there for you. So just to take one of these and hand them around, and that'll probably do it for the whole group. Do you all understand what a URL is?
A uniform resource locator?
Exactly.
Tell you much more.
Well, but at least you know. It's the address, as it were, of the website on the internet, on the World Wide Web.
This guy's for real. He's alive. He'll talk to me. Wow.
I mean, because you imagine people who write books reside in some seventh heaven, inaccessible by normal human beings.
Well, or just inundated with too much stuff to bother with, with a question about your writing. It's great. It's great stuff.
Yeah, well, it's nice to get questions. To put the greatness of writers in perspective, I'll tell you a story about the last time I dealt with my publisher at Bantam in New York. Sitting across from those people above the 50th floor, how I come off to them is, well, now let's see, Mr. McKenna, we have current sales figures in front of us. You're kind of a 60,000 copy kind of guy, aren't you? And frankly, Mr. McKenna, around here that really butters no bread. We're interested in the million-plus seller. We can carry people like you, of course, given that we have substantial successes in other fields, and on like that. To which I replied, so I guess you're not taking me to dinner at Elaine's, which was true. Not even tea. Well, is there anything out of this morning that anybody wants to take up?
Yeah, I had a question when you were talking about growing psilocybin or growing the mushrooms, and it just kind of sparked something in me. Do you have a connection with the Davic realms, the nature spirits? Is that something that comes up for you in this work?
Well, I don't know. Is a self-transforming elf machine a deva?
What do you mean?
This is a phrase that has been associated with me for many, many years. I encounter self-transforming elf machines, which are creatures, entities, perhaps, although they're not made out of matter. They're made out of, as nearly as I can figure it out, they're made out of syntax driving light. But if what your question addresses is the issue of entities on the other side, there are definitely entities on the other side for me, and there seem to be such for many, many other people. I'm not by any standard sensitive. So if I get entities, then they are substantial and capable of defending themselves. It's one of the most challenging parts of the whole psychedelic landscape, because most people can accept the idea of disordered sensory input, recovery of traumatic memory material, so forth and so on. But what are we to do with an elf? That becomes a little harder to contextualize in psychoanalytic theory, although Jung did a good job when he said autonomous elements can escape from the psyche's control and present themselves as independent entities. I'm not sure he's ever seen a self-transforming elf machine. Are those Davic entities, do you think?
Yeah, I don't have any hallucinogenic experience. Myself, I'm more familiar with connections in nature and other experiences that people have had with the Finhorn group or being in the Himalayas, that kind of thing. So what you're saying is through your experiences with pharmaceuticals, you have that experience, even if you're not having it when you're not.
Oh, it's the defining characteristic of the true DMT flash. I mean, it is not subtle. These things mob you like badly trained Rottweilers. They come bounding forward by the dozens, by the hundreds. They jump into your body. They jump out of your body. And I've thought, it maps to some degree over the archetype of the little people, the leprechaun, the fae, and being Irish and being Jungian. I'm willing to entertain, maybe I have a special relationship to this stuff. But then in the Amazon, the people using DMT that I studied in the early 70s, the reason they did it, they said, was to speak with the little people. What puzzles me about my contacts with these beings is it conforms to, let's say, the Irish model. They are small, they live under hills, or when you're with them you have a sense that you are somehow underground. They are full of merriment, almost to a manic and frightening level. It's sort of like a Bugs Bunny cartoon gone berserk. They are friendly, but play rough. In other words, it's a land of explosions and falling anvils. It's like a Roadrunner cartoon or something. But the overwhelming feeling is love, but I spell it L-U-V to distinguish it from the ordinary kind, because it's just this kind of crazy, childish affection. And they're delighted to have me in their presence. Well, now that all sort of corresponds with the Irish model or with worldwide folklore of little creatures, little people in the woods. Mm-hmm. What's happening that is not mappable onto fairyland or leprechauns or Findhornian beings or anything like that, or anything else I've ever heard of, is that these entities have an agenda. And it's a very curious agenda. They use a language which you see. It is made out of sound. In other words, it is sound, but you see it in that state. And the entire point of the encounter, from their perspective, seems to be to teach you to do this. They want you to transform your language. They want you to speak Elfish. And, what? if you've never done DMT and you just smoked it and you're 30 seconds into this experience and this is what it's come down to, you wonder what to make of it. I've thought about this for years and years and years, and I don't know why there should be an invisible syntactical intelligence giving language lessons in hyperspace, but that certainly consistently seems to be what is happening. I've thought a lot about language as a result of that, and several things about it. First of all, it is the most remarkable thing we do, I think. And we talked a little bit this morning about epigenetic behaviors. Chomsky showed that language, the deep structure of language, is under genetic control. But that's like the assembly language level. Local expressions of language are epigenetic. And it seems to me that language is some kind of enterprise of human beings that is not finished. That we have now left the grunts and the digs of the elbow somewhat in the dust, but the most articulate, brilliantly pronounced and projected English or French or German or Chinese is still a poor carrier of our intent, a very limited bandwidth for the intense compression of data that we are trying to put across to each other. And it occurs to me from studying McLuhan and other people that the ratios of the senses, the ratio between the eye and the ear and so forth, this also is not genetically fixed. There are ear cultures and there are eye cultures, print cultures and electronic cultures. So it may be that our perfection and our completion lies in the perfection and completion of the word. Again, this curious theme of the word and its effort to concretize itself. A language that you can see is far less ambiguous than a language that you hear. If I read a paragraph of Proust, then we could spend the rest of the afternoon discussing what did he mean. But if we look at a piece of sculpture by Henry Moore, we can discuss what did he mean, but at a certain level there is a kind of shared bedrock that isn't in the Proust passage. We each stop at a different level with the textual passage. With the three-dimensional object, we all sort of start from the same place and then work out our interpretations. You know, is it a nude? Is it an animal? Is it bronze? Is it wood? Is it poignant? Is it comical? So forth and so on. So this is not a very scientific part of the rap, because it's very hard to convince people that there are non-human intelligences this side of Genebel Ganubi. And when you tell them that these non-human intelligences are accessed through the diminutive mushrooms growing on their front lawn, they just write you off as a squirrel. But this question of the non-human intelligences is very, very much on the agenda. All shamans in all times and places have claimed this. And the thing that so pleases me about DMT is, a lot of people will not take a psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin or something because it lasts hours and hours. Inevitably, a thing lasting that long, you're going to end up dealing with your stuff, your anxiety, your fear, your this and that. And a lot of people don't care for that sort of thing. Whether that's good or bad is another issue. With DMT, it lasts 4 minutes. And so how lost in an examination of childhood trauma can you get in 4 minutes, especially when you have hundreds of elves tugging at your coat sleeves? So it's really an incredibly powerful tool. You know, we have the UFO people claiming there are non-human intelligences, but they have no a reliable method of contact that works for a skeptic. The great thing about DMT is it doesn't require belief, a quality I mentioned last night as belonging to the truth. The truth requires no belief. It is the truth. I'm sure there are probably people listening to my words at this moment who have encountered these entities. This, to my mind, is the great and chilling mystery in the center of the psychedelics. And once you've encountered these things, you have to take them seriously, to the point of you have to understand, where do they fit into the great order of being? What are these things? How can there be a life form not made of matter? In other words, how can they be intelligent and coherent but have no fixed body outline? Is the universe in fact populated by non-human, non-material intelligences that we somehow contact using drugs? I mean, that's one possibility. That's the question, yes. Where are they when you're not there? Is it an ongoing thing? Is something going on this planet? Are these the controllers? Are you getting into a back channel that weren't cleared for? Or, and this is to my mind the most chilling and appalling and exhilarating possibility of all, when you go back over the shamanism thing, you say, you shamans, now where is this all coming from? They will tell you it comes from ancestors. Well, that's a cheerful and fairly sanitized concept, but when you deconstruct it, ancestors are dead people. What is actually being suggested there is that there is a kind of ecology of souls, one energy threshold over, that is co-present with this world. Well, strangely enough, that's what the Irish myth of the Fae says. It says these are dead people. These are souls that linger in our environment, and this is what souls look like. Again, folklore is only a guide, but if what we are dabbling with, if what lies at the end of the road of shamanism is the dissolution of the boundary between life and death itself, then the million-year intuition that this was a path worth following will be dramatically vindicated. And one of the reasons I've preached DMT so furiously is I just want a larger body of people to take it so that we can compare data. We need to understand, how is this possible? It raises a whole host of questions. One is, not only how is this possible, but then given that it is possible, how has it been kept secret? How can millions of people go to the grave, raise children, hold jobs, so forth and so on, go to the grave, and the news of a doorway standing that agape hasn't penetrated? I mean, most people believe they're imprisoned in this world, and that the only hope is maybe 15 years at the ashram and hideous acts of self-abnegation and control and so forth and so on. And actually, the boundary between us and an unspeakably bizarre world, it's 30 seconds away at any time, as long as you have DMT available to smoke. That's appalling to me. I mean, it means we don't know nothing. Yeah.
You talked about trying to map your experiences onto the myths. I wonder if it's possible that you could look at the myths for information of mastery. That is, we've no longer masters of this doorway. We're trying to rediscover a mastery that's been held for thousands of years. Maybe there's something that we can find in the myths that tell us a behavior or a mode of being in that state that would be useful. For instance, catching the leprechaun and getting the pot of gold implies there's some kind of game we can play with them that yields some value.
Yeah, well, the classical myth about leprechauns is that they want to keep you. if they catch you, or if you mess with them, they'll hold you. And then you have to bargain your way out. And the bargain is always the solution of a riddle. Notice that what's happening here is it's all about linguistic prowess. It's all about poetic skill. It's all about language ability. Only the eloquent, only the clever, only those who are masters of riddlery and pun are acceptable to these entities. Apparently that's what they value. Why? I guess because they're made of language. So, and they themselves have, when I try to describe to people what they are or what they look like, various things can be said. They're like self-dribbling jeweled basketballs. In other words, they don't have faces or anything, not the little yellow leather jerkins and the curve-pointed shoes, not that. Self-dribbling jeweled basketballs, and they use the language to make objects. That's what this language, how this language is different from ordinary English. English, we can make meaning. The DMT language makes objects. It's like a higher dimensional language. And so these things bound forward with the complete purpose of delighting you. And they reach into the air, into their bodies, into some nearby invisible dimension, and they pull out what I would call words, puns, objects, hallucinations, things which manage to be all those things simultaneously. And they say, look at this. And it's purely designed to dazzle and astound. And then a colleague will elbow the little guy aside and say, no, look at this. And they're all in front of you, chirping, clamoring. And these objects that they make begin themselves to speak and float away and reproduce. And you've arrived. 30 seconds ago, you were sitting in a room with your grubby friend somewhere pursuing spiritual understanding. Now this is going on. And it's very hard to not be horrified. I mean, the cognitive dissonance, the neck-snapping switch of dimensions. And then after about 3, 4, 5 minutes, it retracts. It loses its vitality, and it begins to pull away from you, almost like a boat pulling away from a dock. And in fact, I had one trip where, metaphorically, not having hands, they all turned and waved and said, "Déjà vu, déjà vu," which is, of course, absurd. Now, people can say all kinds of things. They can say, well, this is just the autonomous substructures of the psyche manifesting themselves. But it sounds to me like a lawyer's explanation. Yeah.
In light of that, allow me to extend the skeptical line just a bit further. Of your description of the event, is it common to everyone who has participated, to your knowledge, does it represent 10%, 50%, 75%? Are they equal in description? Do they vary? Is this unique to your description?
All good questions. It's hard to smoke DMT, especially if you're not a smoker. It's harsh. Some people don't get enough. I would say of the people who smoke as much as I think you should smoke, 75% probably report something like this. It's hard for people to report. I mean, I've had years and years of practice. What I've just told you about this is an incredibly crumpled, compressed, edited version, because what is really happening in there is unspeakably bizarre. Unspeakably bizarre. That seems in fact to be its quality, that it is unspeakable, and that therefore in order to speak of it, you have to make a leap of faith to this higher order glossolalia like language. ayahuasca is a slow-release DMT if you deconstruct it pharmacologically, so that instead of it happening, DMT, instead of it happening in 4 minutes, it happens over 4 hours. Again, at very high dose ayahuasca and at very high dose psilocybin, these entities begin to emerge. When I take psilocybin, sometime in the second hour, I pass through a place which I've learned to recognize. It's a feeling, and I call it elf country. And there are no elves, but there's a feeling. And then I call them, and following the directions of a favorite episode of I Love Lucy, I call them by saying, "Come in, little green men, come in, little green men." It's simply a permitting. It's simply an invocation. And then they approach like a Newari band from a distance. You can hear the brass and the drum, and as they get closer, and it begins as a sound. It's very interesting. It begins as a sound, and as it gets louder, there comes a point where imperceptibly it becomes visible. And then all I can say is it gets bigger, just like someone marching toward you through three-dimensional space. And so it goes from being a little phenomenon on the horizon of your awareness to you're there, you're with them, you're playing the tuba, you're marching along, it's happening. And then they sort of peel off and march away and leave you in the same way they came. The archetype of this phenomenon, as far as I can tell, is the archetype of the circus. DMT is somehow the cosmic circus. And if you analyze what the circus is, it's a closed environment of permitted outrageousness that roves the straight landscape, setting up in one town and then another and then another. And it's a thing of wonder and light. And carny people are loose. They're not like you and me. I remember in the little town I grew up in, every 4th of July, the carnival would come to town for Cherry Day. And we kids were told we couldn't stay out after 9 o'clock when the carnival was in town, because there was just this aura, more liquor was being consumed, more people were staying up late, so forth and so on. And if you analyze the circus, it has all the elements of the DMT thing. I mean, there's the center ring, the clowns. And Henry Munn, in a wonderful essay on psilocybin mushrooms called The Mushrooms of Language, describes them as self-performing acrobatic bits of grammar, is how he describes them. This is clearly the same thing. The circus is a wonderful place for children, but it has behind that a dark side. I think my own earliest reminiscence of what I could call erotic awareness, I must have been very, very young, under 3, because I was being held by people. And I was taken to a circus, and there was a woman there in a tiny G-string costume, spinning, hanging by her teeth up near the center, and it was all there. Death and eros and risk and drama, and I got it. So there's all that in the circus. But then there's also the wiggy side, the bearded lady, the goat-faced boy, the thing in the bottle. That's all just off the main event, and then the circus packs up and leaves, and everything is the same except there's some crumpled paper blowing around in the wind. And every little boy and girl worth their salt wants to run off and join the circus. So this is the archetype of DMT, a completely self-contained, transformative world filled with all kinds of implications. It's incredibly mercurial. It's incredibly trickster-like. Yes, it's as though Hermes had divided into 1,000 subalterns, all set going at once. Well, the blooming and buzzing confusion which the infant experiences is the same world we're looking at right now, except that the infant has no language for it. Now, the interesting thing about the DMT thing is you have no language for it. That's interesting point number one. Interesting point number two, somebody arrives on the scene eager to provide language. That's suggestive.